Very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Callie Nickolai. I'm a wetland project officer with the Natural Resources SA Murray-Darling Basin Wetlands and Floodplains team, and we are one of the major deliverers of environmental water in the SA Murray-Darling Basin region. So I think a number of people have already covered why we're delivering water with European settlement and locks and weirs being built so we can use the water for primarily irrigation and for people as well, that the river has changed from a flowing river to smaller pools, particularly, as Brenton was saying, around the border, around 1,000 kilometres up from the mouth. It's very, very different, very small pools. We also see that there are declines in several keystone flora and fauna species, and the threats will continue with over-allocation and extraction. Wetlands and floodplains have been associated with biota heavily dependent on these flood frequencies and also impacted by drought events. Here I've just got a table showing some of the water that we have delivered in the last few years as the Wetlands and Floodplains team for the Natural Resources SA Murray-Darling Basin. As you'd imagine, it involves a lot of planning, which takes a lot of time. Our planning starts sometimes years in advance, which then culminates in internal review and the outcomes from reflections and learnings from previous years as well. It starts with the SA annual watering planning and prioritisation process, which is generally several months before the actual water year starts, which is 1st of July. Quite often that planning is already starting before we've even finished delivering the water from that previous watering year. Priorities that help determine what sites we water include environmental benefit, risks of applying the water to the site as well as not applying water, other environmental risks that may be associated with it, likelihood and certainty of the benefit of that watering, and also significance of that site. To plan the delivery of water to these sites, we take into consideration things like flooding frequency and the watering history. So for that, we look at what the flooding frequency of those wetlands would have been historically, as well as what it actually is now. And as you can imagine through river regulation, that difference is quite a lot of what historical is and what it is now. We also do a desktop analysis. So that includes looking at the site spatially using ArcGIS of where they're located on the river and in floodplain, lock reaches, and also using a spreadsheet of our own data of where water has been delivered to previously, and how to look at those sites' previous history and what its previous flooding frequency was as to when it possibly needs water. Also, we look at the ecological objectives, which are also covered on this slide. So the main objectives for watering are to promote the growth and maintain or improve the condition of vegetation. So that can include long-lived floodplain species such as river red gums, lignum and black box, as well as riparian, edge and emergent species like sedges. Support and provide habitat for threatened species such as the Murray hardyhead, southern bellfrog and regent parrot. Support and provide habitat for frogs and water birds, and hopefully see some breeding as well. And also probably more recently looked at some sites for bushfire recovery and productivity impacts. And even though these are main objectives for what our watering has been, they're not just limited to those objectives. They can include other things in the future. So here's just a few photos to show, I guess, what we have seen from that pumping or environmental watering. So we've got some beautiful tip growth seen on some young red gums in the actual wetland, and quite typically that growth and change is seen literally within a week of that water going to those trees, which is quite amazing to see. Also see the wetland being utilised by lots of different wading species, particularly as the water levels go down, the water evaporates. Here we have a southern bellfrog metamorph, so we made him, so that was pretty cool. We also made these little guys. So yeah, Emily and I should have spoken about what photos we've used, because she used that one too. But that's because it's a good one, shows the metamorphs as we caught them in the surveys from delivering environmental water. And here's an example of some pretty extensive waterbird breeding of black swans using the red milfoil that came up at this one wetland and building these massive floating nests in the wetland, which was pretty amazing to see. So then there's the logistics. So with the topography of the wetland, we look at where the silt levels and inlets are, and then also try and calculate, if it's not known already, what that estimated volume will be for the wetland. Also taking into consideration what the maximum depth of that wetland, so shallow wetlands may require top-ups to counteract the evaporation, whereas deep wetlands generally only have one fill, and again, that's general. Every wetland is different, and so as a result, yeah, one deep wetland may require top-ups for other reasons. Volume and pump size that we have delivered, so smaller sites obviously can use smaller pumps, so we have used a small little 4-inch pump that can deliver about 2 megalitres a day, and at one of our bigger sites we've used up to a 26-inch pump that can, well, for our project, delivered between 60 and 70 megalitres per day, but if you have a wetland that doesn't have too much lift and you don't have to pump it too far, it can go up to 150 to 160 megalitres per day. As Anne also mentioned about the distance and elevation to be delivered to deliver the water at wetlands, we have delivered up to 250 metres away from the river, and with an elevation up to 12 metres. So we do have sometimes quite significant lift to get that water up to. Also, rainfall and pumping history can also play quite a part. I guess as an example, one of our wetlands, which we'd pumped 2 years prior, we thought we'd know how it would go because there hadn't been a flood in between, and so we thought the water would move the same way, but because it hadn't had water for a couple of years and average rainfall was quite low, the water in the wetland reacted very differently, that it took a lot longer to, it soaked into the soil a lot more than what it did the previous time, because when we had pumped it in previously it was just after a flood, so the soil profile was still quite wet. There's also sometimes different ways and means of doing things, so we're currently pumping water into Yabby Creek, which is on Cataracto Island. There's no vehicle access to that site, so we've had to use a barge with fuel tanks to get the water over there. And yeah, so there's always ways and means of doing everything. For site preparation, we will firstly look at digital terrain models for our wetlands to be able to identify high and low points. Some sites require earthen embankments, or you've used an aqua barrier to prevent that water going back to the river, and also erosion control. So here's an example of one of our wetlands with DTM, and as you can see there's lots of little flood runner creeks where the water, so they're not only sites where you could be putting your pump, because there's lots of sites, creeks that come into the wetland really close to the river, which is really good. But there are also points where the water could be leaving the wetland as well. So pretty much we had to go along to each of those low points to see what issues we may have. And as a result, for I think the number of times that we have pumped it, we've pumped it in to this creek and thought that that was the go, and then we tried it another one. And so yeah, we're always adaptively putting the water into these wetlands. Also just an example of using aquabarrier at one of our sites instead of an earthen bank, and whereas most sites end up having earthen banks built to hold the water in. And for erosion control, we use geofabric to prevent washaways, which, mind you, it wasn't used in some of the first sites, which did make it quite easy to find where the previous pump sites were because they're enormous scour holes, but that made it helpful to find where they were, but we prevent that from happening now. And then for sites which have bigger pumps, generally require rock to prevent the water scouring. Also, timing's very important, generally for meeting ecological objectives. And so I guess the main one would be for frogs, that they generally breed between spring and summer, so we'd generally deliver that water at that time to maximise their breeding potential. It's just an example of some pretty nice frog breeding habitat. We also have complementary works at our site. So at Woolpool Corner we had some pig control. Markaranka we had some dodder control done by the actual landowners of Treasury Wine Estates. We also have links with our in-district team for pest, plant and animal control, and also intervention works. Just when some low points are identified, rather than putting in a large bank, we can use sandbags as well, which is easier to put in and remove. It's just an example of a bit of dodder. Also, we have quite extensive working relationships, as you can imagine. So my pumping contractor's a very big one. Also our landholder and community groups, they're always there with us every step of the way to be able to discuss how we're going to deliver the water, and they're always very involved in the whole planning process, and they are always on site to help us come up with solutions as well. Also with obviously state and federal government officers and other stakeholders like a local council. We use generally lots of phone calls, but also follow up with emails, so we have that paper trail and always ongoing discussions. So here's just an example of on-site discussion with one of the landholders on how we will implement this pumping project, and then the final, well, not the final, but the outcome of that pumping at that site. Of course, there's adaptive management, so we like to learn and reflect from each previous pumping project. So we'll take on new learnings to be able to maximise our ecological outcomes for the future, so whether the site needs more or less water or top-ups, and also always getting feedback from the landholders, who are awesome with giving us feedback on how we can be doing things better, and also sometimes just ringing me to tell me that they've heard frogs calling or they've seen the trees responding. So it's always good to get that positive feedback from them as well. And just finally, some acknowledgements of the awesome people who've been involved in these, this project as well. So our awesome wetlands team, and anyone varying from policy to administration, and engagement officers, and we also have local action planning groups and land care groups, as well as our pumping contractor and Treasury Wine Estates. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Callie. I think you and Anne highlighted the importance of community engagement and the practicalities of delivering water. Probably one quick question.